Welcome, everyone. I'm James Shore, and this is the Art of Agile Development Book Club. Today, we're discussing task planning and capacity, which are central to teams' planning of their day-to-day work. To get us started, I'm going to read an excerpt from the Art of Agile Development. As a reminder, the second edition is out now. It's available in both ebook and print editions, and you can get it from Amazon by visiting jamesshore.com/s/buy-AOAD2. And you can find excerpts and bonus material by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2. Chapter 9, Ownership. Top-notch execution lies in getting the details right, and no one understands the details better than the people who actually do the work. Lean Software Development, an Agile Toolkit. Agile teams own their work. They decide for themselves what to work on, how to break it into tasks, and who on the team will do it. This is because of a fundamental Agile principle. The people who are doing the work are the ones who best understand what needs to be done. They're the ones most qualified to decide the details. Ownership isn't just about control, though. It's also about responsibility. When teams take ownership of their work, they also take responsibility for getting it done. I'm going to skip ahead to the first practice, task planning. Task planning, we have a plan for this week's work. If you follow the practices described in Chapter 8, planning, you'll end up with a visual plan with multiple levels of detail. Valuable increments that could possibly be done in the long term, small valuable increments that are likely to be done in the medium term, and specific stories that will be done in the near term. That plan turns into action through task planning, breaking down stories into tasks and tracking the team's progress. Because Agile teams are self-organizing, task creation, assignment, and tracking is done entirely by the team, not by managers. There are three parts to task planning: cadence, creating tasks, and visual tracking. Cadence. Cadence is the frequency of your task planning. There are two common approaches in the Agile community: iterations, also called sprints, and continuous flow, also called Kanban. Iterations are fixed-length time boxes lasting a week or two. At the beginning of every iteration, you choose a set of stories to complete, and by the end, you expect them to all be done. Continuous flow, in contrast, is an unending stream of stories. You choose a new story whenever the previous one is finished. Teams new to Agile should use iterations, not because they're easier, they're actually harder, but because the strict iteration cadence provides important feedback about how the team needs to improve. More importantly, when used correctly, your iteration capacity gives you the slack to make those improvements. Continuous flow doesn't have the same built-in opportunities for improvement that iterations do. It's harder to notice when your team is going off the rails and harder to justify spending time on improvements. That said, continuous flow is less stressful, and many teams prefer it. So that is the introduction to task planning from the Art of Agile Development. So let's get started with our first discussion prompt. There are two main approaches to task planning on Agile teams. As I mentioned in the excerpt, there's time boxes, which are sprints and iterations, and continuous flow, which is also known as Kanban. What trade-offs do you see between the two, and which do you prefer? Which do you use on your teams, and which do you prefer? There was a pretty interesting discussion about this in the Discord, which you can find at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. Most of the discussion revolved around what is a time box and what benefits does it bring. What I see from a lot of teams is that they use sprints, but they don't actually treat it as a time box. They don't actually take it seriously. The original conception of time boxes was that, at least according to Rapid Development, which was a book by Steve McConnell, it was envisioned as a 60 to 120 day period, at which point you either shipped your product or the product was rejected. And at that point, the customer could choose to just say, well, we're done, or they could choose to pay for another time box. But rejecting a time box, missing that time box, was a really big deal. It wasn't something that teams were expected to do. One of the stories McConnell tells in his book is about a company that did time boxes for years, and after the first year, they never missed a single time box. That's not what I see when people are using sprint or Scrum-based time boxes. What I see much more often is that people get to the end of the time box, they get to the end of the sprint, and they say, well, we didn't finish everything. So we're just going to keep on going, and we're going to carry things over into the next sprint. So what are your experiences with this? Is there a benefit to working in this sort of time box, or, well, sort of time box, or is it better to just, since that's de facto continuous flow, is it better to just have continuous flow? Chris has bravely raised his hand. Thank you very much, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, James. I think if you're doing iterations or sprints, I think there's a huge amount of value in holding yourselves accountable to making a commitment in that small time box and delivering the commitment, and viewing failure to deliver on your commitment as something that you inspect and you address and you retrospect on so that you can do better next time. For the teams that I work on, we try and hit about 80% of our commitments. And we found that 80% gives us, a lot of confidence and a lot of certainty in that time box and an ability to deliver, but also gives us, a little bit of flexibility in that 20% to push ourselves to try and do more, to take some risks so that we kind of balance off the certainty and the risk. But I think if doing iterations, when it carries over week, you lose a lot of the benefits.
Yeah. What about, so I love that idea that we're deliberately trying to not hit everyone, that we're going to push ourselves because, they say if you're not failing, then that means you're not pushing yourself as hard as you could. One of the things that's come up on the show a lot is the question of stakeholder trust and customer involvement. What do you see when you're hitting that 80%? What kind of impact do you see that having on the way your product owners and other stakeholders are viewing the team?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And probably one of the biggest benefits is the sense of trust and whole team that we get with our product partners. Because when they see us deliver every single iteration, then they can be confident that when we talk to them during planning and say, hey, there's this trade-off we have to make and we can't do both, they understand that, okay, if we say we can do one, that we will deliver it, and that making those trade-offs or those cuts are things that actually result in working software. So I find that teams where our iterations carry over week, there's not as much product trust, there's not as much collaboration, there's not as much unity.
Yeah. And this is a huge problem. I see it over and over on a lot of teams. So it's just a small matter, of delivering those iterations reliably. Thanks very much for your comments, Chris. I'd like to invite Chadwick to share his thoughts. Chadwick, welcome to the show.
It's good to see Chris' case about, you have 80% of the commitment, but I would say that I am so unlucky that, it's very unlikely to reaching 50% of the committed item in the sprint planning at the end of the sprint. I will supporting more on the iterative, just like running the sprint time process, because after running so many of the waterfall project, when running in the Agile or running the sprint, at the end of the sprint, the retrospective is really helpful because every sprint will raising up the new problem. And also for those problems, if we do not have a good moment to solving them, it will last long and also influence the next sprint. So what we carry over to next sprint is because what we cannot solve something in the previous sprint, and we do not have a good moment, good time, and good approach to solving those problems. I did one with something just purely running the Kanban because they are doing all the repeatable job tasks, just like hiring, walkthrough, first interview, second interview, last interview, background checking, step by step. Then it is going on and on and on. But it's likely that it did not have a time to, make them to doing anything to lean the process or improve it. So some of my sharing, but I would like to hear more about Chris, how can doing that 80% commitment, if you don't mind to share.
You brought up, as you were talking about the continuous flow, you were saying that makes sense when people are when they're doing hiring, for example, when you've just got this ongoing thing. But I think you are also making the point that it's harder to stop in retrospect when you do that. And I think, it's certainly possible to still have your retrospectives on a regular cadence in a continuous flow system. But I would agree that the iterations make it really crisp and clean and easier easier to see. Chris, if you're willing to share a little bit more about how you achieve those commitments, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Thanks very much for your comments, Chadwick. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, what I found really amazing is that treating an iteration as a true time box, a true commitment to deliver working software, that by doing it, all of the other practices that we find in the book all kind of support it and round it out. Because if you're making and keeping commitments in your iterations 80% of the time, you're going to have something that you can demo to build stakeholder trust. You're going to have some type of predictability in delivery on a small scale, so you can start doing a little bit of forecasting. You end up blocked during iterations, or you find out that you are stuck waiting on ops, or you don't know the answer to a question. So you have to address it right then. You maybe limit work in progress, you do mobbing, you do pair programming so that when somebody gets sick, someone else can jump in and help. You have a team room that people can just jump in when they need support. So really, I guess what my team does is we look at the book and we have retrospectives and we say, hey, what didn't go well this week? Why did we miss? And which practice can we use to try and help bolster where we're weak? And it really, like, doing everything all together, everything supports other practices.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, one of the things I really like about iterations is when they're treated seriously, which most teams don't, but when they're treated seriously, they're this amazing forcing function to really cause you to think, what can we improve? And when people do that, I'd love to hear that. I love that your teams are working this way. When people do that, it really does work. But you have to take it as that commitment and not be willing to just let things fail over. We got a lot of hands up, so I'm going to go ahead and invite Michael to talk. Michael, welcome.
So as usual, I had multiple thoughts competing for time. I think for the iterations, more often than not, I see them used as some kind of shield or sprints. That, if you want something, it's not going to fit in the sprint, and you have to fight on some meeting for maybe the next sprint or sprint in whatever time in the future. So that would be one way to look at it, or one extreme that I have seen teams, and then there are other teams and they use none of that. They don't have any sprints, or maybe they do, but just for accounting. But when you want something, they say, okay, well, let's look at what we can do, right? And they usually deliver, even if it takes them maybe 1 day or maybe 1 hour. They give you back something. They don't give you back, you have to wait in queue because our sprint is full. So that's kind of what popped in my head regarding this.
Thanks for your comments. This was actually a point that was raised on the Discord as well as a downside of iterations, is that it's a problem where people will not do the most important thing just because it won't fit into the sprint. And that the sprint sort of becomes this artificial bottleneck that prevents the team from doing the most effective thing. Although in the following discussion, there was this discussion, well, maybe the issue is in that situation is that teams are not splitting their work down smaller. And so there's a problem to figure out. Would you say that that's true in your case, Michael?
It can be one of the reasons. The other one is they are not willing to, change the sprint once it's quote unquote committed, which I find is not exactly what sprints were meant to be.
Well, I think in the original conception of Scrum, at least, sprints were something that you commit to, and then changing what was in the sprint was considered to be a pretty big deal. How long are your sprints?
Typically, it's 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks very much for your comments, Michael. I'm going to invite Navila up. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Navila, welcome.
James, your original question was around, like, how do our teams use time boxes? I work in a team that maintains an integrations platform for our internal customers. And oftentimes we do value delivery, but we also have like tons of failure, demand, and product health items. And just most recently, we had some work where we had an incident and we wanted to investigate moving over to a different type of technology. And obviously, when that happens, we want to introduce a spike, and often like those investigative type of work items have time boxes. One thing that our software development manager on our team has done with time boxed tickets is to have a default decision recorded. So like we would go around, document however length of time we decide, like let's say 8 Pomodoros, which is roughly 2 days. And then we would document our findings, but we would have a default decision. If we couldn't present a case to move forward with this investigation, we would do something else. So I think that kind of helps with the continuous flow. Also, it helps a team that doesn't have that much expertise making decisions on their own, because we have lots of like turnover and like with the way the pandemic is, for example. So like it's helpful to have that default decision to move forward with our task planning.
I love
and hopefully
that
present a case.
Mm-hmm. I love that technique because I've definitely seen teams use time boxes for investigation, but the time box was really just a checkpoint. It was if you got to the end of the time box and you're trying to make a decision, but you don't feel like you're ready, you just have a conversation with the other members of the team and then create a new time box. I love this idea of, well, here's our default. If we don't get to a conclusion by the end of this time box, then we're going to do this instead. Do you find that adds more focus to the people who are doing the decision-making work?
Definitely, because it does also address some of the pains that developers could have had. Like some developers on our team are very passionate about changing the architecture and having that sort of period where we have product health sprints, I would say like every 6 weeks, but instead of waiting those 6 weeks, we can like actually look at it before it becomes worse. So it just kind of alleviates some of the stress that the people on our team might have around that.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much for sharing. I'm going to invite Goran up in just a moment. And before I do that, though, I just want to let you all know that our next topic, the next discussion prompt that I want to bring up is about estimating. So I'm going to give you all a chance to start thinking about that. What role do you think estimating should play in task planning? While you're thinking about that, Goran, I'd love to hear what was on your mind. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Several things. So I found, because I have different teams, one doing Scrum, one doing Kanban, that the nature of their work is also influence which one is going to better fit. For example, we have operations. The nature of their work is so disrupting. So the sprints, so it would kind of fall apart. So that will kind of influence, okay, maybe Kanban is better suited versus sprint. The thing that I found is that you mentioned there, it's the trust. With some companies, there is belief, if there is a pressure of the deadline, the team will kind of be able to focus and work better. But then there is this, I want predictability. What I found often is when I do analysis between the story size, for example, and the cycle time, rarely I found there is, correlation that, along the story, it's all over the place, which brings different, topics into this one. Why is this happening? Is our estimation wrong or stuff like that, which is usually it's different, it's a process, it's a flow, bottlenecks, dependencies, and all the stuff. And I believe also the Scrum guide changed the language, I believe, from commitment to forecast for the sprint. So which tells a little bit kind of what's the belief there. The things that I found that help team, whenever new things wants to drop into a sprint, I usually coach them to say, okay, can it wait until the next sprint? So this is to ask. And I was surprised, 50% of the time, or 80% of the time, whoever wants to bring it to disrupt sprint said, well, yes, 2 weeks or a week later, yeah, that's okay. The second thing, okay, if we cannot, do I have a Slack, which is, I believe, next topic that you also have there. And the answer is yes, then yeah, I would say team, take it because you have a Slack. And if you don't, then, the last question is, then we have to take something out. Mm-hmm. So this is in a way to kind of foster the discussion. In my mind, the discussions are kind of a no-brainer. But I found for the teams to ask this question, it's immensely difficult. And I still don't know why. When I asked them, they said, yeah, makes sense, but this is a manager. I shouldn't, kind of a tester or ask manager if he made the wrong decision or it's a product we want to please and stuff like that. So that's what I found help this time boxing interruptions to kind of a minimum, but they're also allow the flexibility because life goes on and we cannot stop until we finish our sprint.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's the point you're making there, that often it is okay to wait because it's on average in a 2-week sprint is only going to be another week before it gets started. That's what I find too, especially, and those interruptions tend to come up more in my experience, it tends to come up more when a company is new to doing Scrum or Agile in some way, especially in teams that are meeting their iteration, actually delivering what they said they were going to deliver every sprint. Those interruptions go away because people become more comfortable with the process. I think the interruptions in the beginning come from people thinking, well, if I don't get my stuff in now, it's never going to happen, right? There was something else you mentioned that I really want to highlight, which is that different types of work do tend to benefit from different types of approaches. Kanban, if I recall, David Anderson originally created what people call Kanban in software, although it's not a great name because it's got sort of some implications that tie into the lean manufacturing. But in his original practice of Kanban, I believe what they were doing was very much bug fixing and maintenance type of work that doesn't have a lot of predictability to it. And you do just want to take stuff in as it comes along. And I find that continuous flow is a really good fit for that unpredictable work where we don't even know what's going to happen in 2 weeks or a week. So it doesn't make sense for us to plan. So thanks for bringing that up, Corin. I appreciate it. And I'd like to invite Scott on up. Scott, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks. Let's see, I have 3 points. I'll be short on all of them. The first one, you just completely stole my thunder. I was going to comment. I have almost no experience in Kanban. 95% of my teams use Scrum, therefore we use time boxes. But the ones that I recommend and seem to be fairly successful using Kanban are teams that are primarily doing maintenance. They might get some new functionality. It's pretty small, nothing major, but they're doing a lot of bug fixes. Or like I have a team that just makes configuration changes for customers. And these are like 1 and 2 and 3 hour changes, and they have a constant flow of work coming in. Those teams seems to use Kanban fairly well. My second point is I have been on teams. Again, it was brought up earlier where there have been 2 or 3 days left in a sprint in a time box, and they have basically said, okay, we know this functionality, the story is going to take 3 or 4 days, so we're not going to start it. So let's go work on something that's less meaningful to our customers. And once I bring up the point, I'm like, you guys, if you repeated that back, like I should have recorded what you just said because it's just ridiculous. Because something doesn't fit in the next 2 or 3 days, you're going to work on something that's less important is to me horrible. Like I don't care if it fits in the sprint anymore. So it's just a comment more than anything else. I have seen that. And then my main point is, a lot of the teams that I work with will do a lot of analysis in a sprint and some UX prototyping in a sprint. And eventually 3 sprints later, they get to the implementation and actually start writing some code. But boy, in those first couple of sprints, they complete all of the analysis. They complete all of the prototyping, and they pat themselves on the back and they buy donuts for everybody because they've completed everything that they planned for in the sprint. Therefore, the sprint was successful. And when I ask them, let's go to the review, man, let's go get some feedback from our end users, they're like, well, we don't have anything they'd be interested in. So we need to be careful about just because we complete our work within whatever time box we have, that doesn't mean you're doing it right. That doesn't mean you're agile. That doesn't mean you're successful. because you don't have anything to show for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that ties into one of the readings that I put up for this week's book club was the done practice, and I think it does tie into, well, what do we mean by done? And I would certainly argue that if you were doing something that's about prototyping and you're not getting feedback from people on that prototype, then you didn't really finish the work.
Sure.
But I think you're raising a lot of, I think, downsides of the sprint, which is that it is artificial. It is something that people can choose not to do something important because they don't have time, rather than splitting their work. They can choose to think that they're done with something just because they did what they committed to, even if they haven't made a difference to the customer. Thanks very much for your comments, Scott. Again, I'd love to hear what people think about the role that estimating should play into this. I know estimating is a big topic, a lot of contention. I'm not talking about long-term forecasting, but just estimating the work that needs to go into the sprint, or if you're using continuous flow, what role you think estimating should play in that. While you're thinking that over, I'd like to invite Jim up. Jim, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, James. Boy, this is a rich topic.
It sure is. Yeah.
I absolutely love it. Oh gosh, estimating, done, iterations, Kanban. Oh, so Kanban, I agree, very, very helpful approach to doing the work. And sometimes we look at Kanban as just however long it takes to get the work done. So estimating may be a little less important. Estimating really important when you're operating in iterations, because you obviously don't want to over or under commit. You want to ideally get it just right, which is not easy to do. Kanban, I find, is really helpful in environments where there's a lot of volatility. And I agree, it can be very useful in doing maintenance and minor enhancements and things like that. However, maintenance, I don't think it's a good long-term solution. I would prefer for the team that created the upstream, the situation that caused perhaps a downstream defect or thing, to be the same group that fixes that defect. And if we work in iterations and we're trying to estimate appropriately what we can fit into an iteration, it's incredibly disruptive to have things popping up from production, just getting in the way of the work that we had planned out for the current sprint. So if we work in iterations and we have the same team who built the feature responsible for the maintenance of that feature in the event that anything goes wrong, there's an incentive on them to truly get to done during the sprints and not create this adverse downstream effect. So I think that's a powerful effect of iterations that it requires discipline of ensuring that the team that created the defect is the one, in fact, that then has to deal with the disruption that defect has, as opposed to essentially outsourcing it to a maintenance group. And that tends to obscure the signal for everyone that this upstream poor behavior of not truly getting it done is, in fact, really interfering with the creation of value and making a good overall healthy ecosystem. So essentially creating a virtuous cycle where it boomerangs back on the team.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. I do not think that a maintenance team that is responsible for basically cleaning up a feature team's mess is a good idea. I've never seen that work well. There's just so many things that can go wrong there. You don't have the same knowledge of the code. You don't take responsibility.
And of course, a Kanban team could also be responsible for the messes that they made. However, the iteration creates this kind of microscope where it really heightens the attention on the adverse impact of this disruption, whereas in the Kanban, it might just stretch things out a little bit or potentially a lot. And you have to be looking at things like cycle time, and then, are all requests normal or requests of different sizes? So how can we actually figure out that, that's not a good thing that happened to that? It just took longer to get done.
Yeah. Thanks very much for your comments, Jim. I'm actually going to use this as an opportunity to seed the next part of the conversation, which is, and again, we've got some people with their hands up, so I'm going to call on them first, but I'd like you to start thinking about how teams improve their capacity and their productivity. We're talking about using the iteration as this microscope, as Jim mentioned, to sort of zero in on what the team can improve. Well, how do teams actually make that improvement? The book talks about this feedback loop between slack and capacity, which uses the team's weaknesses to make them stronger. What other opportunities do you see to improve capacity, and how have you seen teams use their slack to improve their capacity? Anyway, I'll let let you all think about that, I'm going to go ahead and invite Michael up, who's had his hand up for a little bit. Michael, welcome back.
So for the estimating, and actually it's kind of for the next topic as well, I do love it as a tool to, do some reflection on how the team is doing, and especially how is it going against what I would call this hungry eyes vision at the beginning of the sprint or the iteration. So what can be accomplished reasonably in 1 or 2 weeks? It's not that much of time, right? So and as long as it's taken this way and it's not the subject of challenging or disputes, then this is a great tool to improve focus and do things like that. So that's on the microscopic level.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give Sarah a chance to talk. Sarah, welcome.
Well, I guess I'll comment on both topics a bit. I'd say when it comes to the things I've seen the most with time boxing, root cause on a lot of that is the same things that we talk about over and over and over again. So Chris was calling out all the things that time boxing, helps make you do. Not doing those things, though, are all the reasons that time boxing can be really, really hard for a team. And the biggest of those, I think, is the sizing, of how you not making things small enough, and then work in progress. And it gets worse and worse if you keep missing commitments and you do that continuous flow thing, because then you're always going to kick off a new sprint with two things: the new goal that you made for yourself, plus the stuff you have to finish from the prior one. And people don't give that the same, that visual attention to, oh, well, that actually means I'm working on multiple things. And you're just setting yourself up for kind of that continually failing to meet those commitments. And again, I think that's about the size too, because if you can right size some of those things, then you can have that focus moving into the other ones. Your other comment about Slack and capacity, or how can you improve capacity? And I commented in the Discord on this as well, but a really big part of that, I think, is retrospectives being of the really, really, really focused on ways to improve whatever is going on, within your process, and really investing Slack time towards those improvements.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to sort of highlight the point you made in the beginning, which is that when I see teams get into this cycle of missing commitments, it's really hard on the morale. It's definitely, Chris talked about sort of a virtuous cycle of you hit these deadlines and or not deadlines, but you hit these time boxes, you create trust, you create the ability to get things done. Well, the reverse can also happen. When a team doesn't hit those time boxes and they allow stuff to drag over and they don't reduce their predicted capacity and response, or, some people call that velocity. I'm not a big fan of that term, but then stuff just keeps piling up and piling up and piling up. And I'm not sure if I have a point there. I just wanted to highlight that because it's something that I see on a lot of teams. Have you seen a solution to that, Sarah? How do you get off that train?
I think you have to pare back what you're making as commitments, and then work on ways to think of making things smaller. Making things smaller is the thing that I see teams struggle with the most. And technical debt tends to make that much harder, because it's, when we think of what we want something to be small, we still want something that's small and demonstrable. And we tend to think of that as demonstrable in a way that if you were building something new, that would, you could build something demonstrable end to end in a system that's got a lot of tech debt can be big, no matter how small what is demonstrable to a customer would be. And I think that those are the things that, so it becomes harder and harder, to make things small. But to me, the way you've got to do that is take a step back. And, if you're missing commitments, adding more goals and then still trying to carry over is not going to get you anywhere, sprint over sprint. So finishing up so that you can focus, and then looking at ways, really asking the hard questions about how are we breaking this up? How can we rethink how we're building these things in a way that can make them smaller, are the ways that I think it.
Yeah, that certainly matches my experience. I've actually worked with several teams now where they were in this sort of feedback loop that you're talking about, this negative feedback loop, and or vicious cycle. And my guidance has just been cut back, reduce your capacity, what you actually start and finish in a single sprint or iteration, and see what happens. And what happens is that morale on the team improves immediately. And they start having the time to, rather than just struggling to get everything done and hacking it in, and then of course making their lives worse, they start making improvements. But morale improves right away. And then several months later, as things get better in the code, then their capacity starts to improve as well. Right. But the patience on the business side for that isn't always there. Because of course they've had, go ahead.
Oh, but it's one of those things where it's like, you're not actually getting any less if people weren't meeting their commitments, they weren't meeting their commitments. So, just asking for more commitments is not actually getting more outcome, but it does. I have the same, from on the business side, it's like, no, we want the commitment, to. Yeah.
I wish I could put that on a billboard in 200-foot tall letters. Saying you're going to get more done, but not doing it is not better than saying you're going to get what you actually can do done. Yeah. I think this does come back to trust. Much of this comes back to trust, because I do see that broken trust between product and engineering, where it just turns into this contentious, I'm going to ask for the world and I'm going to be disappointed no matter what. And then on the other side, I'm being asked for stuff that's not important. So I'm just going to, turn off my brain and do what I'm told and not try to make things better. So the key, cut back, learn how to split the stories. I think that does make a really big difference. And I think that's a good spot to stop for today. Thank you very much for your comments, Sarah. Thank you to everybody else who participated today. Next time, I am very happy to announce that Kent Beck will be joining us for a discussion of evolutionary design. This is one of the most important practices in Agile and also one of the least followed. So I am thrilled to have Kent joining us for this discussion. Kent Beck is, of course, the creator of extreme programming, which is the basis of many of the Agile practices people use today, including evolutionary design. That is going to be on April 29th at 8 a.m. Pacific. You can find more about that by going to jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 book club. And the Discord conversation, well, it can start whenever you like, but I'll be seeding the conversation with prompts starting Monday. And again, the Discord is at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. Great conversation today. Thank you again, everybody, for participating. I appreciate you and your involvement. And I will see you all next time.